Vasily Ivanchuk is a great competitor and a great artist. And I'd like to show you a few little snapshots from his games from this Minorca Open that he won with 8 out of 9. And I think these little pieces from his games show these qualities very well. So first of all, this was a round 4 game against a Cuban grandmaster. Ivanchuk's played a beautiful endgame. And you can see he's in complete control here with this outside pass pawn, a distant pass pawn, which means that Black's king had to travel over to the queen side. And now Ivanchuk is ready to just switch the other way with his king. And he cruises in and takes these 2 e-pawns. Now, this is a wonderful positional squeeze. Great endgame. So he's getting there. He forces the knight away and takes this centre pawn. So now he's a pawn up and he's ready to push that f-pawn down the board. Okay, nothing too remarkable so far, but it's just near the end where I'd like us to focus, actually. So he's just got to make sure that this d-pawn of Black's is under control. But of course, he's calculated this very well. The secret of good technique is good calculation. And there we go. This f-pawn is rolling down the board and Black plays d2. Right. Here is where I'd like you to have a think. I'll have a drink. Now, how would you finish off this game if you're playing white? So Vasily Ivanchuk, white to play. I know what I'd do in a flash, but let's see how he played it. Okay, so anyway, white to play. Cheers. How are you going to finish the game? Well, if I were playing white here at the end of a long game, this is move 84, then I would just put this knight back to e3 and stop the d-pawn, and then this f-pawn just rolls through. I mean, this is a very, very simple way to play the position. I mean, this knight can jump around and try to cause a bit of trouble, but the king steps out of the way. This king comes in, knight d1. You can see secure blockade, and on the next turn, the pawn rolls through. Incredibly simple way to finish. But no, Ivanchuk goes a different way. He plays f7. He allowed his opponent to make a queen, but he's calculated that with this new queen, he can actually win the game. So he had to calculate the consequences of the king moving here, here, or here. Okay, well, first of all, let's check out king c6. Well, queen d6 check. Now, 2 possibilities. The king goes to b5, then check and mate. The king goes to b7. That's check and mate with the knight. That's very nice. Okay, so king c6 doesn't work. Okay, what about king b5? Well, that actually transposes to one of those variations. That's checkmate. Okay. And in the game, Black played king c4. That's the third alternative that Ivanchuk had to calculate. And knight e3 simply wins the queen with a fork. Very nice indeed. But isn't that funny how, I mean, this shows what an artist he is, that instead of an incredibly simple move where you really don't need to calculate very much at all, he's prepared to just calculate that little bit further and win in style with this move. Great stuff. Okay, well, this next little fragment shows you what a competitor he is and how he senses the moment. Well, it's actually his round 1 game, and he's playing quite a weak player comparatively, who's a Spanish player rated 2,171. And Ivanchuk has played the Dutch, and he's had some pressure, but White has found counterplay here. So his opponent, Campins, has just retreated this knight to d2, challenging the knight on e4. Now, I'm sure that there was time pressure involved at this moment. Ivanchuk could have just exchanged on d2 and taken the pawn on c4. But he didn't do this. Now, why not? Well, it's interesting because with this pawn on b6 and the bishop looking on the pawn on b7, White could play queen a1, and with this queen coming down to a7 and potentially the rooks doubling on the d file, White is very well coordinated, and for a pawn has actually quite a lot of pressure. And notice that White's king is now very safe. There's no touching the king side at all, and Black's king is potentially a little bit vulnerable. So he didn't go for that win of a pawn. I think that's quite understandable. Instead, he obviously thought, right, it's now or never. And Ivanchuk sacrificed a piece on the king side and took here. So it's an impressive lineup. And White exchanged rooks. Now, what's Black got for this piece? Well, he's got 2 pawns and a check. In the old English weekend tournament circuit, sack a piece, if you get 2 pawns and a check, that was deemed good compensation. And actually, it's about right for this position. So the king steps up, but here's the crucial move. Ivanchuk plays f4, and of course that means that White's king is starting to open up. But still, White is reasonably well coordinated, and he played knight f1, just guarding g3. Ivanchuk exchanged and played queen f4, so that's quite scary. So he's pinning the knight. This pawn is under attack. This pawn is also loose. Black's piece is pretty good. That's an interesting moment in the game. White played a very brave move. Bishop takes b7. Wow, and that really raises the stakes, because if White can hold out, then that pawn on b6 is just 2 squares from the queening square. It's quite scary. So Ivanchuk played rook e3, hitting the knight. So this is pinned. And as I said, this must be a time pressure moment, because here White collapsed. He should play rook g2, and actually it's still not clear, because if that is taken, then if Ivanchuk recaptures the knight, the bishop comes back, and that pawn is really dangerous. In fact, best play here, queen d4 is a reasonable move, and actually the game should end in a draw like that. That's probably best play. But White cracked by playing queen g1, and queen takes h4. Ivanchuk won. White resigned. Obviously, if king g2, rook takes g3, and the queen is lost, and, well, actually White's king is in desperate trouble as well. Game over. There you go. Fortune favours the bold, but actually an excellent practical decision by Ivanchuk not to take the initiative rather than grabbing that pawn, and then White would come back in the game. Now, I'd like to show you the end to his last round game. Now, this is an extraordinary game, because Ivanchuk was leading the tournament. He could have played safe. A draw probably would have been enough to get first prize probably just shared first prize, but he really went for it. And I mean, this was what you call a fluctuating struggle. Ivanchuk found himself in an endgame, the exchange down, but had very good compensation, but somehow it went a bit wrong. But they reached this very tense position where you can see Ivanchuk's pieces look pretty good in the center of the board. And he's got two big pass pawns on the queen side. But this pawn is starting to motor down the board. He played c4 check. Now, White's king has the choice of 3 squares. Now, again, this comes down to this thing. The secret of good technique is good calculation. One retreat loses, one retreat draws, and one retreat wins. Which is which? Which would you play? White to play and win. Well, this is still fantastically complicated, and it's the end of the game. I mean, this is move 49. The players wouldn't have had that much time. White got it wrong. In fact, King A2 should be a draw. King B2 wins, but Ivanchuk's opponent, Pranesh, an Indian Grandmaster, played King C2. And this loses. But let's see how, because this is absolutely beautiful. The game went King D4. So that covers the C3 square. Basically, Ivanchuk, of course, wants to push these pawns down the board. And if he'd checked straight away, then the king steps up. And, well, that's not good. Blockaded pawn. So King D4. That covers the C3 square. Rook F6. So White needs to shepherd that pawn down the board. B3 check. The king steps to the side. Knight D3 check from Ivanchuk. And King A3. Well, if the king goes back, then C3, you can see that's going to be winning for black. But King A3. I mean, maybe Pranesh had reached this position and simply thought, well, this is safe enough because C3 isn't happening because of king takes B3. But Ivanchuk isn't winning. He played King C3. Now, if the G-pawn advances, then Knight E1 and Knight C2 mate. Fantastic stuff. So that's why Rook H6 was played, so that Rook can potentially check the king. Then B2, okay, you want to get a queen, so the Rook came back to H1, stop that. And now this was the last move of the game. Knight C1, fantastic. Just blocking out the Rook. Here, White resigned, but this was such a pity. If he'd been a little bit more generous, then he would have played G6, allowing the under-promotion to a knight and checkmate. That would have been a fitting conclusion. So there we go. Ivanchuk, what a competitor, but what an artist as well. And I think these fragments show how brilliant he is at calculation. I hope you enjoyed those, and hopefully we'll be seeing more of Ivanchuk in the future. I do hope that he continues to play at such a high level.